The rain had been falling since morning, soft and steady, wrapping the small suburban street in a quiet rhythm. Inside the cozy two-story house, Claire moved around the kitchen, humming to herself as she stirred a pot of soup. The sound of jazz played faintly from the radio, and everything felt calm, peaceful even. Her husband Daniel was in the living room, pretending to read the newspaper, but mostly lost in thought. They had been married for 8 years, long enough to find comfort in silence and routine. Then came the knock. It was gentle, but sharp enough to break the calm. Claire frowned, wiping her hands on a towel. They weren't expecting anyone. Daniel looked up briefly, curious but relaxed. "I'll get it," Claire said, walking toward the door. The moment she opened it, her breath caught. The man standing there wasn't just a visitor. He was a memory, one she'd buried deep. It was Ethan, the man she had once thought she'd spend her life with. The man who had left without goodbye. Now he stood before her, rain dripping from his hair, a faint, uncertain smile on his lips. "Hi, Claire," he said quietly, his voice both familiar and distant. "I didn't know where else to go." For a second, she couldn't move. The years between them disappeared, and all the words she never said rose up in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder at Daniel, who had risen from the couch, his expression unreadable. Time seemed to slow. The warmth of the house met the chill of the storm outside. And in that space between, 3 lives suddenly tangled, Claire managed to whisper, "Ethan, what are you doing here?" He shifted awkwardly, eyes full of exhaustion and something close to regret. "I just needed to see you. I shouldn't have come." But he stopped himself. The silence stretched, heavy and uncertain. Daniel stepped closer, calm but firm. "You're soaked. Come in before you catch cold," he said simply. He didn't ask questions. He didn't demand explanations. He just opened the space between them, quietly letting Ethan step inside. Claire watched in disbelief. Her husband, the man who never lost his composure, was offering warmth to the one person who once broke her heart. Ethan hesitated at the doorway, then nodded slightly. "Thank you," he murmured, stepping into the familiar home that wasn't his. The air inside felt different now. The sound of rain grew louder against the windows as Claire hurried to grab a towel. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it. She passed the towel to Ethan, her fingers brushing for the briefest second, a spark from another lifetime that she quickly pulled away from. "Sit down," Daniel said, his voice steady, though his eyes lingered on Ethan for a moment longer than polite curiosity. Ethan obeyed quietly, sitting at the edge of the couch, towel in hand, looking small in the warm living room light. Claire stood behind the couch, not sure where to look. Daniel returned to his chair and folded the newspaper, setting it aside. The clock on the wall ticked louder now. No one spoke. The air was thick with questions, memories, and something deeper, an understanding that this moment meant more than any of them wanted to admit. Finally, Daniel broke the silence. "So," he said gently, "how do you two know each other?" Claire's heart thudded. She opened her mouth, but Ethan spoke first. "We used to know each other a long time ago," he said carefully, his gaze flickering toward her. "College days." Daniel nodded once, his expression calm. He didn't press further. Instead, he stood, went to the kitchen, and poured another cup of coffee. Then, without hesitation, he brought it back and handed it to Ethan. "Here," he said, "warm up." It was such a small act, but it felt enormous. Claire watched her husband in quiet amazement. There was no anger in his face, no hint of jealousy, just calm acceptance. It's a kind that comes from someone deeply secure in who they are. And yet, something inside her twisted. Because his silence, that strange, gentle silence, said more than any confrontation ever could. Ethan took the cup and nodded. "Thank you, Daniel," he said softly. "I didn't mean to intrude." "It's fine," Daniel replied, sitting back down. "Rain like this can make anyone knock on an old door." The words were kind, almost poetic, but Claire could feel the weight behind them. Daniel was not a man who said things without reason. She could hear the message hidden underneath. "I see what's happening. I trust you. But I'm watching." Ethan looked around the room, his eyes landing on a framed wedding photo on the shelf. Claire and Daniel on the beach, laughing under sunlight. His expression faltered slightly, and he looked away. "You've built a beautiful life," he murmured. Claire didn't know what to say. She felt caught between two worlds, the comfort of the present and the ghost of what might have been. She studied Daniel's face, waiting for a sign of how to feel, but he gave her none. He just sat there, composed, sipping his coffee as though this wasn't one of the strangest moments of their marriage. After a long pause, Ethan finally spoke again. "I shouldn't have come," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I just didn't know who else to turn to. Everything's falling apart, and for some reason I thought of you." The confession hung in the air. Claire's throat tightened. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions. Why now? Why her? But she couldn't find the words. Daniel looked at Ethan kindly. "Sometimes life brings people back not because they belong again, but because they need closure," he said quietly. Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the floor. "Maybe you're right." The rain eased outside, the steady tapping slowing to a whisper. Ethan stood, setting down his empty mug. "I'll go," he said. "Thank you for the coffee, and for letting me come in." Daniel stood too, walking him to the door. "Take care of yourself," he said, his tone calm, almost fatherly. Ethan paused for a brief second, his eyes meeting Claire's one last time. There was so much unsaid apologies, memories, wishes that no longer mattered. Then he nodded and stepped out into the soft rain. The door closed gently behind him. The sound of the latch echoed through the room. Claire turned to Daniel, her heart still racing. He looked at her, then at the door, then back again. He didn't speak. He didn't ask who Ethan really was. He just picked up his newspaper again and said quietly, "The soup's starting to boil." That was all. No argument, no questions, just calm. But that calm held more emotion than anger ever could. Claire stood there, unsure whether to cry or smile. She realized something she couldn't yet put into words. Sometimes silence isn't emptiness. Sometimes it's love. And as the rain faded into the distance, she couldn't stop replaying the moment Daniel let Ethan stand there and said nothing. The next morning felt heavier than usual. Claire woke early, though she hadn't slept much. The sound of rain had stopped, leaving behind a calm that somehow made everything feel louder. The ticking clock, the hum of the refrigerator, her own thoughts. She moved through the house quietly, avoiding Daniel's eyes as she poured coffee. He greeted her with his usual calm tone, asking if she wanted toast. But she could tell they were both pretending nothing had happened. Ethan's visit had left. Something hanging in the air, not anger, not guilt. Just an unsettled silence. Claire couldn't stop thinking about the look on his face when he stood in the doorway, lost and drenched. As if time had carried him back to her, only to remind her of everything she had moved on from. She tried to push it aside. There was laundry to fold, emails to answer, errands to run. But every quiet moment pulled her back to that scene. Ethan's voice, Daniel's silence, her own confusion. When she looked at Daniel reading the morning news, she wondered what he was really thinking. Did he care? Was he hurt? Or was his silence just indifference? By the afternoon, Daniel had gone out for work, and the house felt too still. Claire made herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, staring at the gray clouds outside. That's when her phone buzzed. A message. From Ethan. "Thank you for letting me in yesterday. I didn't deserve your kindness." Claire's first instinct was to delete it, but something stopped her. She read it again, her heart tightening. There was nothing inappropriate in his words, just sadness, a kind of loneliness she remembered well. Still, she knew replying was dangerous, not because of what it might start, but because of what it might awaken in her. After a few minutes of hesitation, she typed only 2 words, "Take care." Then she locked her phone and left it on the counter, forcing herself to focus on the laundry. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the years they had shared. The way he used to make her laugh, and the way it had all fallen apart when he'd left without explanation. It had taken her years to stop wondering why. And now, here he was again, as if time had looped back to test her heart. That evening, Daniel came home later than usual. He seemed tired but calm, setting his briefcase down and loosening his tie. "Long day?" Claire asked gently. "Yeah," he said with a faint smile. Traffic was awful. He went to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, then looked at her thoughtfully. "You've been quiet all day." Claire hesitated. "Just thinking," she said softly. "About him?" The question hit her like a wave. Daniel's tone wasn't angry, just honest. A quiet question from someone who already knew the answer. Claire looked down. "A little," she admitted. Daniel nodded, not surprised. "It's okay," he said. "He was part of your story once. You're allowed to remember." She looked up at him, puzzled by his gentleness. "You're not angry?" He shrugged slightly. "What would anger do? I saw the way you looked at him yesterday. It wasn't love anymore. It was unfinished emotion." His words stung. Not because they were harsh, but because they were true. She didn't love Ethan, not in the way she once did. But his sudden appearance had shaken something loose in her. Maybe it wasn't about wanting him back, but about realizing a part of her heart had never fully closed that door. They ate dinner in near silence, the sound of forks against plates filling the space where their thoughts should have been. Daniel didn't bring Ethan up again, and Claire was grateful. She needed time to process, to understand why her heart felt like it was split between the comfort of the present and the echo of the past. Later that night, she sat on the couch, scrolling through old photos on her phone, not of Ethan, but of the life she had now. Pictures of her and Daniel hiking last summer, laughing over burnt marshmallows. The way he looked at her during their anniversary dinner, quiet but full of love. She realized how lucky she was. Daniel wasn't dramatic. He wasn't controlling. He was calm, patient. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to make her feel safe, and yet something in her still felt guilty, not because of Ethan's visit, but because of how deeply it had affected her. 2 days passed before she saw Ethan again. It happened by accident, or maybe fate had a strange sense of timing. She was at the local cafe ordering her usual caramel latte. When she turned and saw him sitting by the window, notebook open, coffee untouched. Their eyes met and the air around her shifted. "Claire," he said, standing up quickly. "I didn't expect." "Neither did I," she interrupted, her voice calm but guarded. For a second, they both stood there in silence, unsure of what to say. Then Ethan gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Just a few minutes." She hesitated, then nodded. Maybe she needed this, a conversation, a goodbye that never happened. They sat down and Ethan exhaled. "I've thought about that day so many times," he said quietly. "The day I left, I was scared. I didn't know what I wanted, and I thought leaving would make it easier. But it didn't. It just made me smaller." Claire looked at him, studying the face that once held her whole heart. Time had changed him. There were faint lines near his eyes, a weight in his expression that hadn't been there before. "You hurt me, Ethan," she said softly. "You disappeared without a word. I waited for months." "I know," he said, his voice cracking. "And I'm sorry. I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to say it." She nodded slowly. "You should have come sooner." He smiled sadly. "You look happy now. He seems like a good man." "He is," she said simply. And in that moment, she realized something important. She didn't feel anger or longing anymore. She felt peace. When she got home that evening, Daniel was on the couch watching a movie. He looked up, smiling. "How was your day?" he asked. "Good," she replied, sitting beside him. "I saw Ethan again. We talked." Daniel paused the movie, giving her his full attention. "And I think that part of my life is done," she said, voice steady. "I needed to see him one last time to understand that." Daniel reached over, took her hand gently, and squeezed it. "Then I'm glad you did." Claire looked at him, really looked, and saw what she had almost missed all along. Love doesn't always shout or demand attention. Sometimes it's the quiet presence that stays even when life gets messy. That night, they sat side by side in the warm glow of the TV. Claire felt something inside her settle. Ethan had been a chapter, But Daniel was the story that kept going. And though her heart still remembered the past, she finally knew where it belonged, outside. The wind picked up, brushing softly against the windows. And for the first time since that unexpected knock, Claire felt at peace. The days that followed were quiet, almost too quiet. The tension that had filled the air after Ethan's visit seemed to have faded, but Claire could still feel its echo. She went through her routines, cooking dinner, tending to her plants, chatting with neighbors, yet everything felt slightly off. It was as though the house had swallowed her thoughts, and Daniel's calm silence had become louder than words. Ethan's second visit had given her closure, or at least that's what she told herself. They had talked, said what needed to be said, and walked away with peace. But deep down, Claire was still unsettled, not because of Ethan anymore, but because of Daniel. His silence haunted her more than Ethan's voice ever had. He hadn't asked for details, hadn't questioned her decision to meet her old flame again. He had just trusted her completely, quietly, without hesitation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she watched him sitting on the back porch with a cup of tea. The fading light touched his face, soft and golden. She realized how rarely she told him what he meant to her. They had built years together, but somewhere between comfort and routine. They had stopped sharing what they truly felt. She joined him, sitting beside him on the wooden step. "You're quiet again," she said softly. Daniel smiled faintly. "So are you." The air smelled like cut grass and rain. They sat there for a moment, listening to the sound of the evening birds. Then, unable to hold it back anymore, Claire turned to him. "I need to ask you something," she began. "That day, when Ethan came to the door, why didn't you say anything? Why did you let him in without asking who he was?" Daniel's eyes stayed on the fading light. "Because I saw your face," he said simply. "You looked like you were standing between your past and your present. I figured it wasn't my job to close that door for you." Claire blinked, caught off guard by his answer. "You trusted me that much?" He finally looked at her. His eyes were calm, steady, full of quiet strength. "I've always trusted you, Claire. Love without trust isn't love. If I had told him to leave, you might have spent the rest of your life wondering what he had to say. I didn't want that for you. You deserved to know what was unfinished." His voice wasn't bitter. It was warm and honest, the kind of tone that carried no blame, only truth. And that truth hit her harder than anger ever could. Claire realized that Daniel's silence had never been weakness. It had been faith. A kind of faith that gave her space to find her own peace, even if it hurt him in the process. Her throat tightened. "Weren't you afraid I might still have feelings for him?" Daniel took a deep breath. "Of course I thought about it. I'm human, Claire. But I also know you. You don't live in the past. You just needed to face it one last time." His words made her eyes sting. She looked away, blinking back the tears that threatened to fall. "You're a better person than I am," she whispered. He chuckled softly. "No, I just love you differently. Some people love by holding tight. I love by standing still and letting you breathe." The silence that followed was different, softer, warmer. Claire felt something shift inside her, like a knot finally loosening. She hadn't realized how much Daniel's quiet strength meant until now. That night, at dinner, she went upstairs while Daniel stayed behind washing dishes. She stood in front of the mirror studying her reflection. She didn't look like the young woman Ethan once knew. Her hair was shorter now. Her eyes lined with faint traces of years lived and lessons learned. But she also didn't look like someone who regretted her choices. She looked like someone who had finally grown into herself. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. For a moment, her heart skipped. But it wasn't Ethan. It was a reminder from her calendar. Their wedding anniversary was next week. She smiled to herself, a small, grateful smile. When she returned downstairs, Daniel was sitting on the couch reading. The soft lamplight made the room glow gently. She sat beside him and leaned her head on his shoulder. He looked at her with quiet curiosity. "What's that for?" he asked. "For being patient," she said. "For not asking what you already knew." He smiled and kissed the top of her head. You don't owe me an explanation, Claire. You never did. We just keep moving forward. His words wrapped around her like a blanket. She felt a warmth she hadn't felt in days. Not excitement, not longing, but deep comfort. The kind that comes only from being truly seen and loved anyway. Over the next few days, something between them began to shift. Small things. The way they talked more during breakfast. How Daniel started leaving her little notes again. How she made sure his coffee was ready before work. They didn't talk about Ethan anymore. There was no need. That part of their lives had passed quietly, leaving behind a deeper connection than before, still sometimes late at night. Claire thought about how silence had changed everything. If Daniel had reacted differently that night, if he'd been angry or possessive, she might have pulled away. Instead, his calm had grounded her. His stillness had spoken louder than any words could. A week later, they went out for dinner to celebrate their anniversary. The restaurant was small and intimate, lit by candles and soft music. As they ate, Claire watched him from across the table, the same man who had once walked into her life on an ordinary day and never left. "I never thanked you properly," she said between sips of wine. "For what?" Daniel asked. "For that night," she said. "For letting him stand there. For saying nothing." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then smiled. Sometimes silence is the only way to show trust. She reached across the table and took his hand. "Well, it worked. It reminded me that I already have everything I was ever searching for." He squeezed her hand gently. "Good," he said softly. "Then maybe we can stop looking backward." Claire nodded, her heart full. For the first time in weeks, she felt completely at peace. She realized that life wasn't about avoiding storms, but learning to find the calm inside them. When they left the restaurant, the night air was cool, and the city lights shimmered in the distance. Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulder as they walked to the car. The world around them felt still, quiet, but alive, just like them. That night, as she drifted to sleep beside him, Claire thought about everything that had happened. The knock at the door, the silence that followed, and the love that had endured. She finally understood that real strength in love isn't loud or controlling. It's the quiet belief that even when tested, the bond will hold. And as she closed her eyes, she realized that Daniel's silence hadn't been distance at all. It had been devotion, the kind that listens more than it speaks and loves without needing to prove it. Autumn arrived quietly, brushing the streets with golden leaves and a soft chill in the air. A few weeks had passed since Ethan's unexpected visit, and life had slowly settled back into its rhythm. But something inside Claire had changed. It wasn't dramatic, more like a gentle awakening. She looked at Daniel differently now, not just as her husband, but as the man who had loved her through silence, who had trusted her without needing proof. One Friday afternoon, Claire decided to take a walk downtown. The air was crisp, the sidewalks lined with people wrapped in scarves and smiles. She stopped at a cafe for coffee, and just as she stepped out, she saw a familiar figure across the street. Ethan. He looked different this time, calmer, lighter, almost at peace. For a moment they just stared at each other, both unsure whether to pretend not to notice or acknowledge what fate had put in front of them once. Again, Ethan raised a hand in a quiet wave. Claire hesitated, then crossed the street. "Hi," she said softly. "Hey," he replied. "Didn't expect to see you here." They ended up sitting on a park bench nearby. It's the same park they had once walked through years ago when they were young and uncertain about everything. The trees above them swayed gently, the leaves falling like old memories returning for one last dance. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again," Ethan said, his tone gentle but honest. "I wanted to thank you for hearing me out that day, for not shutting me out." Claire smiled faintly. "You didn't owe me an apology, Ethan, but I'm glad you gave one. It helped me understand things I didn't know I still carried." He looked down, twisting the lid of his coffee cup. "I used to think we'd find our way back someday. But seeing you now, I can tell you've found where you belong." She nodded slowly. "I have. And it's not that what we had wasn't real. But it wasn't meant to last. I think we were just two people trying to find love before we really knew what love was." He smiled, a little sad but sincere. "I get that now. You've changed, Claire. There's a calm in you that wasn't there before." She looked at him, realizing he was right. That calm wasn't just maturity. It was the peace that came from being truly seen, from being loved in a way that didn't demand explanation. Daniel had given her that without ever asking for it back. They talked for a few minutes more, about small things, life, work, old friends, until finally the conversation fell quiet. Ethan glanced at her, a hint of nostalgia in his eyes. "He's a good man, isn't he?" "The best," she said softly. "He loves quietly. That used to frustrate me sometimes. But now I understand real love doesn't always need to speak. It just stays." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "I'm glad you found that. You deserve it." Claire smiled gently. "I hope you find peace too, Ethan. You deserve that as well." They stood, shared one last hug, not of longing, but of closure. And just like that, the past that had once haunted her felt lighter, like a chapter finally closed. As she walked away, the autumn wind lifted her hair, and she felt free in a way she hadn't in years. When she reached home, Daniel was in the kitchen fixing the leaky faucet again, the same one he had been meaning to replace for months. The smell of dinner filled the air, warm and inviting. He looked up when she entered, his usual calm expression softening into a smile. "Hey," he said. "You're back early." "Yeah," she replied, setting down her bag. "I ran into Ethan." Daniel paused, turning off the water. "Oh, yes," she said, walking closer. "We talked." "Not for long. I think we both needed to say goodbye properly this time." He studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "Did it help?" "It did," she said, her voice steady. "I finally realized what your silence meant that day." He tilted his head, curious. "What do you think it meant?" Claire smiled softly, eyes glistening. "It meant trust. It meant you loved me enough to let me face my past without fear. You didn't try to protect me from it, you let me find my own way back to you." Daniel's expression softened. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her fingers. "Sometimes silence is the loudest way to say I love you," he said. Her heart swelled at his words. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. "Thank you for letting him stand there that night," she whispered. "Thank you for saying nothing." He smiled. "I knew you didn't need words from me that day. You just needed space to remember who you are." That night, as they sat together at the dinner table, laughter returned to their home, gentle, real, and easy. Claire realized that what had almost broken them had actually made them stronger. She saw how Daniel looked at her, not as someone fragile, but as his equal, the woman he chose every day without needing to say it out loud later. As they watched a movie together, Claire leaned into him, her head resting against his shoulder. She thought about how love changes over time, how it starts with sparks and ends with quiet steadiness. The kind of love that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, but stays even when tested by the ghosts of the past. Before going to bed, she stepped outside for a moment. The night was cool, the stars scattered above like promises. She took a deep breath and smiled. The ache that had once filled her chest was gone. Ethan had been a lesson. Daniel was her life. She went back inside, where Daniel was already in bed, half asleep. She climbed in beside him, curling up close. He opened his eyes just enough to pull her into his arms. "Everything okay?" he murmured. "Perfect," she whispered. "Everything's perfect." He smiled, kissed her forehead, and drifted back to sleep. Claire stayed awake a little longer, listening to the rhythm of his breathing. Feeling the quiet peace between them, the same peace she'd mistaken for silence all those years. Now she understood that real love isn't proven by grand gestures or endless words. It's proven by presence, by the moments when someone stands beside you quietly. Trusting that love will speak for itself as she closed her eyes. Claire thought back to that first knock on the door, the shock, the tension, the questions that had followed. Everything had changed that day, but not in the way she feared. It had reminded her of what she already had, a love built not on noise, but on understanding. And in that stillness, she realized something beautiful. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can say is nothing at all.